let's take a look at Substance Sampler. I like to call this the little brother of Substance Designer. Historically, this software used to be called Substance Alchemist, and it was designed to mix multiple materials you would have created in something like Designer. Nowadays, it has a lot more features, and while it's not as robust as Designer, it can help you create materials as well as accomplish a few other techniques very simply and much more quickly than Designer. When you first open the software, you're going to see an interface similar to this. Obviously, it might not have something in the recent list, but we're just going to hit Create New Project. Now, your interface might look a little bit different than mine, and even if you go to Window Reset Default Layout, like I will do, it still may be a little different. Two of the possible changes could be this window may be popping up and it might be saying, hey, this is a new feature. We have AI generative stuff in it. That's cool and all. Just hit OK. And then to exit this, you might think it's this because your brain is wired to think of the X button, but it's actually re-clicking the button that opens the tab. So just click that to remove it. And the other thing is you might be seeing a 3D and a 2D viewport. That's up at the top right of the viewports. You can switch that to any view you want. I'm going to keep it on 3D for now. Now, obviously at the top left, we have the file menu where we can save as, edit, do all these things, but there's not that much here. Mostly what you're going to be messing with is the actual interface itself. Over here, you have some specialized tools that might be common in general image editing, like crop, perspective transform, and clone stamp. Those can be accessed in other ways as well. And there is a button that is starting to be added to all Substance software, which is Get Content. This is if you want to get content from their library that has more materials and everything like that. Very often you have to pay for those. You have your project stack, which is the materials that you create. It starts with a default untitled one. Environment lights and 3D objects. We're not going to go over these in this intro tutorial, but 3D objects especially is kind of cool. They're working towards allowing you to not only import 3D objects and put materials on them, but also there are features and functionality within this software to do photogrammetry. Below that, we have the assets, and this has all the materials, images, filters, texture generators, and anything else you might need in it. Now, 99% of the time, you're going to be keeping this on materials. And I personally like to change this to group by category and display as a list, only because I find this easier to find what I want. Now, if you prefer it a different way, keep it that way. It's totally fine. Down here in the bottom left, we have the other panels that are not open by default. One of them is Generative AI, which we'll talk about much later in the video. The other one is Viewer Settings. So this allows you to change the viewport settings. And the most important part of this is honestly which preview mesh you want to use while creating your material. I'm going to keep it on a plane for now, but you can imagine how some of these could be very helpful. And then underneath that, we have shader settings. Now, shader settings adjust how the material will be rendered. If you have a mission, do you want it to glow? How much height and displacement do you want? All these other things for the renderer. Basically, I don't mess with this that often because the features that I do want from this are in a quick access menu we'll go over in a second, but just know it's there. And then finally, you have channel settings. And this is just, do you want these particular channels available to mess with in the software? So do you want to deal with opacity and everything else? I, again, leave this on by default because when you export out whatever you need, it's going to cut out the information you don't need. Next, we have the viewport and the controls above it. So this is the title of the material. This is the resolution. And this is if you want 3D, 2D, 3D, or only 2D. And then this allows you to make it full screen if you need to. I don't very often use that, but it is there. At the bottom of the viewport, you have a little info button, which teaches you how to manipulate the viewport. So Alt and left click and hold rotates around. And if you look here, it says that. Alt and right click, or using the mouse wheel zooms. And then Alt plus middle mouse button pans. And there are a few other controls we'll go over later. But next to that is camera, which allows you to change the field of view. I leave that alone. Displacement, which is actually really important. This is one of the things that you're going to use quite often is the displacement quality. I personally like leaving this on 1 just because I want the highest quality preview available. But you do have to understand that whatever software you output the textures you're creating into your final renderer, it may not displace as well as this software unless you change settings. Tiling allows you to change how many tiles you see your material or texture tile, and you can type in higher values. So if you want it more than 2, you can do that. And then finally, we have enable shadows. I don't leave this on very often. I pretty much leave it off just because it's a performance hog and it's not needed for most materials that you're creating, but it is nice to know it's there. And then on the right side, we have a couple more panels. One is layers, which should be pretty obvious if you're used to any other type of software. Basically, we can create materials and effects, and they're going to layer on top of each other. It does work in an order where the bottom is where it starts, and each layer above it is additionally added to the calculations. The properties for whatever you have selected. So contextually, let's just say I have a base material. If I have it selected, you can see its contextual properties. I'm going to go ahead and delete that out, hitting the delete key. And then in the layers panel at the top, it is important to note that you can add base materials, custom filters, and everything like that. And I will say something that is a little bit weird about Substance Sampler is that adding things from here is different than dragging them in from here in certain cases. And sometimes things will exist in one and not the other. And that's really inconsistent and annoying. And I hope Adobe fixes that eventually, but it's something to know about. And then the very last panel is this right side tools. And these are just setting physical sizes, which we're not going to deal with a whole lot, but it does allow you to measure your materials in real world physical sizes so that certain effects will work more accurately. It's not necessary, but it is something to know that it exists. Expose parameters is actually pretty good. Basically, if you don't know what exposing parameters is in Substance, that basically means that any parameter we expose on any of the properties is then available to be manipulated if you export this material out to a different Substance software. So if I take the material I create in here and put it in Substance Painter, I can then modify the parameters that I expose within Substance Painter. I don't have to come back to this software. Designer has the same features. They all do. They're designed to be used together. And then honestly, the biggest one is export. You're eventually going to want to export out your material either as textures or as a specific file to be used in the other software. Knowing all of that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save my project. So I have a specific folder I'm going to use, and I'm just going to call this tiled materials, because I'm going to create a lot of different tiled materials within this Substance Sampler archive. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And then this first material, I'm going to rename it. So I'm going to left click on it, and then I'm going to hit F2 to rename. And I'm going to name it Concrete. Now I'm going to hit Control S to save again, just to make sure everything's saved. And in the Assets panel, I'm going to again switch it to Category and List. And this is one of the things I kind of annoys me. This changes a lot. It goes back to the default. But I basically want Concrete Cast. So I'm just going to drag that material into the Layers panel. And there we go. So technically speaking, this material, if you were just going for a perfectly tiled cast concrete surface or material, this is it. You have it done. And if I hold on Shift and right click, I can rotate the environment light around and you can see it sheening on the surface. And if I go to 3D and 2D, you can see that what it has created is the base color, the normal map, the roughness, the metallic, the height, the ambient occlusion, literally everything for me right away. I have options to control whatever material I add. So there's various different starting points. There are random seeds. So if you just want to keep generating it until you find one that you like, you can change the color variation. So if you want it to be more contrasting, you can change the roughness values. So if you want it to be more rough or less rough, which would be more shiny, reset that to default. You can change the roughness variation, which I really do love. So you can see if I make it really, really shiny, you see the specular spot. As I change the variation, it breaks it up or makes it a larger spot. I'm going to reset both of these to default. And then you can also change if there are cracks in the concrete. And you notice that when I change that, a new slider appears, and that's the scale of the cracks. So as I change that, I can make the cracks bigger or smaller. Again, this is still a perfectly tiling surface. So if I come in here and change the tiling amount, you can see there's no seams. Even if I put it at something like 20, it is noticeably tiling, but there are no seams. So put this back at 2. Now, very quickly, just to show you, if you ever did mess with this stuff and you wanted it back to just the complete default, there is a reset all settings button on the properties of every single layer. So if I click that, it goes back to the default. So we're going to go ahead and save this again with Control S. And I'm going to go ahead and right click on this layer and hit duplicate. And I'm going to call this one Pavement. And so for this duplicate, I'm going to create it as cast concrete that's cracked. It almost looks like blacktop now. And what I'm going to do is add another layer called Pavement. And you can see it adds in this filter. And there's a lot of options in these filters, and there's a lot of filters, but I'm not going to have time to go over them all. Let's go over some of the most important settings. So you can change the joint in between them from cement to a custom joint, meaning you can drag in any material here and it will make it that. So let's say I wanted a cotton jersey as the joints, which makes no sense, but you can see it actually works. I don't, so I'm going to switch it back to cement. And then the next thing that's important to know is not only do you have all of these options on intensity of tilting the different pieces, the different squares or segments, you can choose what is creating these segments. So under pattern mask, we're set to square tile, and there's various presets for that and options. But I want to change this, and you can see there's a lot of different options in here. The ones that I want to deal with right now is called flagstone. And when I put that in there, you can see it kind of looks like broken up large cracks within some sort of like paved area, almost like the road is falling apart. Now I can change the scale of that, which I want to. I want it to be larger. I don't want it to be that many small pieces. And I can even turn down the warping. So if I want it to be a little bit more consistent and flat, I can do that. I'm going to put that at about the middle. And now with that, I can change the bevel radius to make those lines thinner or thicker. And I can change the tilt intensity to tilt each one of those sections a little bit differently. And I can change the random elevation of each piece. So you can see this looks like a really damaged, broken road. Like it's falling apart and it won't be around much longer. But this is a pretty interesting surface. Now, I'm going to turn up the tilt intensity and the random elevation intensity quite a bit, just so that we can see a pretty large difference. And then I'm going to turn down the volume in pavement volume intensity a lot, because I want each piece to be a little flatter, and that's what volume intensity does. It kind of like makes them more unique in how they're shaped instead of flat. I want them to be flatter. Turn it up a little bit, like about there. Now for bevel depth, I'm going to turn that down quite a bit. I want it to be about there, and then I'll turn up the bevel radius a little bit. And then I'm going to come into joint and change the joint height to be a little higher. It's got to be subtle. So what I might want to do is come back up here and turn up the bevel depth a little bit. And then I'm going to turn down joint variation a lot so that it gets more consistent. And for the joint color, I'm just going to make it darker. So something like that. Now I'm just making an interesting material to show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then I'm going to duplicate it because now we're going to add other things to it. So pavement, effect, water. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in another layer called water. And when I add that in there, you can see now there's water puddles in between the pavement area. Now I can choose the water level. I want it to be higher or lower. And you'll notice that everything looks wet right now. That's because of edge wetness and edge wetness distance. So if I turn down distance a lot, it'll just be wet where the puddles are. If I turn it up a little bit, it's like a little bit outside of the puddles gets wet. How wet those edges are is up to this slider, edge wetness. You can choose how much it's blurring underneath it. You can choose the intensity of the color. So if I make it really intense, you can see it's like super obvious that that's wet right there. You can also come down to the bottom, and there's a lot of options to make it look like there's sludge in those areas, to make it look like there's dirt in those areas, to make it look more like they're waves if they were larger water areas, or foam hitting the areas, the edges. So there's a lot of options here. And in fact, if you turn on dirt, there's even a slider for oil density, and if you turn that up, it'll look like an oil spill. Now, this is pretty cool because this allows you to basically manipulate a lot of different surfaces very quickly. Any surface I want, I can add water to. It just needs height variation for you to be able to notice it well. And again, this is 100% tiling. So this could be tiled 20 times and it's still seamless. Now, I also want to mention that there are a lot of other things, like there's snow, there's smudges, there's dirt, there's cracks, and many, 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 many more. So we're going to go over some of those in the next few materials. So let's go ahead and save this. And now let's start a completely brand new material. And what we're going to call this is, we'll hit F2 and call it brick wall. Hit Control S to save. And what I want is I want to start with terracotta. And then I'm just going to go to add layer and type brick for brick wall. And you'll see immediately it creates a brick wall. Looks pretty interesting. I can move the light around. There's lots of variation in there. And there's a couple different Special variations, don't fall into the trap of thinking that this is the one that you want because it doesn't have those lines. You probably do want this one, you just need to change some of the parameters. So you can change the type of bond if you wanted different types of bonds. I personally just want regular. You can change the brick type, and what you probably want is flat because this is the most common in Western countries. But there's a lot of types in here, including even frogged and frogged text, which is really cool. So you got a lot of options in here. You can change how much it tiles, but I personally like it where it is. Under mix, you can change it if you want to mix certain brick types, so you can have multiple different types of bricks in different ways. I'm not going to do that, but you can. Under cement, you can change the cement color, the roughness, how thick the lines are. I personally like that a little thinner than they have by default. And you can change the disorder. The cool thing about the disorder is if you turn it up slightly, it just goes inward. But if you turn it up massively, it starts coming out also, which I think is pretty cool. But I'm going to leave that on normal. And if you come to the section called age, you can basically change how much variation there is. So right now you can see there is some disorder. Even if you set it to 0, there is some, because that's pretty common, and Sampler tries to make things as realistic as it can. Now I can turn that up and make it really crazy, but I kind of want it to be just slight. You can change how many of the bricks are like shattered and broken if you want that. I like keeping that on very lightly. Brick unstuck actually removes bricks. I don't personally like that. I also don't like massively messing with the edges, but you can. This changes the color variation. I like keeping that really low. And dirtiness, I don't like doing that simply because I'd rather use decals in my final renderer for that. But even just this default version already is looking really nice. There's only one problem I have with it, and that is if you zoom in kind of close, which to be honest, you're probably usually not going to get this close, you'll notice that it's kind of like blurry or stretched along the edges. Displacement pretty much always does that because it cannot manipulate the UVs. So when it moves vertices up all of the sudden this much, it's going to stretch the texture. You can see if I turn off displacement, it's not a problem. But the more displacement you have, the more it's noticeable. So there are options. You could also always just not really use a lot of displacement or none at all. But personally, what I like doing is blurring my height map just a little bit. So if I come in here and add a new layer and call it blur, because that's what I want is a blur, you can see it looks really blurry, but I don't want to blur the entire material. I want to come down here and only blur the height map. And so if I do that, you can see now it's kind of just pulling it out at a softer degree. And I can choose how much I want that to be affected. So if I'm okay with, like, say, like that, I'm still getting interesting shaping with the light, interesting form. But even if I get close, it doesn't look as atrociously awkward. So there are ways to handle that and make it better. Now, I think the last thing I'm going to do personally is just turn down my tiling a little bit. I'll probably go with 3 and let's say 6. And I think that looks better. And so we already have a wonderful brick wall texture that we can use now. And again, if you personally prefer certain different sizes, like maybe 3 and 7 looks a little bit more interesting because the bricks are longer, feel free to do that. Do whatever you want. But here's a brick wall. We'll hit Control S. Now let's add another new material, and we'll call this one metal. Hit Control S. And for this, we're going to drag in brushed metal. So I technically do just want a brushed metal tiled material, but one thing I want for it is it to have smudges and other things like that. Like right now, this is so perfect. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put in smudges. And you can see that already starts breaking it up a little bit. And I can choose what I want it to look like. There's a lot of different options. I'm going to leave it on this currently. I'm just going to turn down the intensity a little bit because I just want some variation in there. And then under brushed metal, I'm also going to come in here and turn up the roughness a little bit, not a ton, just a little bit, because I personally prefer that. So I'm gonna hit Control S because I want to save this. And what I'm gonna do is create a brand new material, and I'm gonna call this one metal plated. Now I want to show you something interesting. We don't have to drag materials from here. You could have materials, from different software packages and everything that you bring in, but you can also grab the materials that you're currently creating and put them as a layer in a new material. So I can take that metal I just made and use it in this one. And then I can add a filter called panel. And paneling allows you to create all sorts of different types of panels. They have some default ones for you, depending on what you might like. What I want is I want bulkhead overlapping rivets. And you can see again, the texture is actually a 4x4, even though this is tiled twice, so its preview's 8x8. But I honestly do want this, and I'm okay with that because I'm going to understand that I can stretch this larger. The one thing though is I really kind of don't want it square. I personally want it more rectangular. So I'm going to use something like this, and actually I'm going to do it on the other axes. So 2x4. And now I'm going to come down here and under seams, I'm going to leave it on overlap, but y'all can check out the other ones. They're pretty cool. I'm going to leave fasteners on. And under fasteners, I'm going to change it to hex bolts. So that's changing these to hex bolts. I'm going to make their size bigger. And I'm going to make the amount less. And then I'm going to replace the material and make the color darker, because I just want very obvious bolted metal plates. And you can see we still have the smudges because we're using our original material variation. And now if you wanted to, depending on what this was going to be put on, you can make it look like it's bulging in different directions, which is pretty cool. Or you can add wrinkles. You can do all sorts of cool things to this, but I'm going to currently turn down the color variation just a little bit. And I'm going to turn up the reflection variation, because I want certain ones to be more shiny than the others. And now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up the offset to about where they're offset like this. Because again, I'm just going for interest. And now I should be able to use this, especially with decals, in a lot of very interesting ways. So I'm going to hit Control S to save. And I'm going to create another new material. And this one I'm going to call Metal Perforated. Hit Control S to save. I'll drag in my metal. I'm going to add Perforate. And you can see what it does is it immediately starts cutting holes in it. Honestly, this is good enough to go with, but I personally kind of want it to be not square. And I can come in here and I can change this in a lot of different ways. So they have a square. I'm going to go with a circle, and I want it more circular. I just think that'll look more interesting. So I'm just going to turn down its scale a little bit. And this is already looking pretty cool as something we could use in a lot of different areas. But now what I'm going to do is add some rust. So I'm going to type rust on the filters, and it always comes in and it's insane. I'm going to turn down the spread a little bit so that there's just a little here and there. And they also have oxidation and a lot of other things if you want to mess with them. but I personally just wanted a little bit of rust. And I know that when I use this, I'm not even going to have displacement, so it's going to look similar to this. So that's already pretty good. Change the height scale back to 0.05, and we'll save this. Now let's do something completely different. So let's add a new material, and this one we're going to call wood floor. So for this one, we're just going to go to the wood section and add in wood plane. And again, you can choose a preset that you like. I personally think this one is totally fine for what we're going for. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to look for parquet. Now, parquet is spelt weird, so just type PAR and add that in. And you can see immediately it makes it look like wooden floor panels. So there's a lot of options in here, but the truth is that the ones that I personally think matter the most are down here under the chamfer radius, because the default version, while it looks kind of realistic, it's really hard to tell that they're separate pieces of wood. So even if you turn up the chamfer depth, which pulls it down a lot, they're so thin in so many areas, it's kind of hard to see when you're looking at it from like here. And depth isn't even the correct thing anyways. What you want is the radius. So I like turning these up a little bit and overemphasizing that they're separate pieces of wood. Because now you can see pretty well that there are lines in there. And if you turn up the depth now, it becomes even a little bit more apparent. And you can make this as obvious as you want. Probably leave it somewhere there. I like it a little over exaggerated. Now, tilt intensity and stuff doesn't really work that much in this particular filter, and I wish it did. It kind of messes with the normal map some, and it is doing stuff. It's just almost unnoticeable. And while you can type in larger numbers, it causes issues in other areas, so I wouldn't recommend it. But then you can also change the offset of the wood under the generator itself for the pattern mask. So if you want them offset differently, you can do that. You can even change the pattern mask to different types, including things that technically wouldn't even make sense for wood. You could do that. But let's say I didn't want it English and I wanted it a basket weave pattern. You can do that. So I actually kind of like this. This looks interesting. It's not something that you would normally see in construction, but I do think it's interesting. So we'll go ahead and leave this. But I also do want to mention you still have all the other layers that you could add on top of it if you wanted to keep adding more settings. But for now, we'll save this. And the next thing we're going to do is add a new material and call this marble tile. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look for marble in here. And we're just going to search, add it on. And then we're going to type in floor tiles. So the second we do that, we can see we're already starting to get like marble tiles. Obviously, though, the problem is that the gaps are too large. Now it's using the square tile generator for its mask. So the common thing for that is you want to turn up shape scale to 1, turn down the gradient to very low, like 0.01. And then when you come up here, you can change the bevel radius to get it to be thinner or thicker. I don't know why that's not the default, but it is what it is. Make it a little obvious. Pull down the depth. And then we'll come down here for gap, and we're going to turn up the gap height. Because generally speaking, when you do floor tiles, the grout is pretty close. We'll turn down the gap irregularity. And we may even have to type in on gap height, we'll type a 2. so that we can pull down from that. And it looks like for me it was 1.08 is kind of similar to what I wanted. Now you can see this already looks really good. If you were going for just like a marble square tile, that's really awesome. But now I have the ability to change the shape size and the amount in each direction. So if I wanted it to be larger rectangular tiles, I can do that. I can change their offsets. So under offsets, I can change the different modes. What I want is this one. It's like quincux horizontal. I don't know how you pronounce that. That's okay. And let's say I just wanted them half offset like this. That looks really cool. Like maybe this is a shower wall even, right? So pretty interesting. Okay, now if you wanted it to look like it had been aged and wasn't done that well, that's what age is for. So you can change the tilt of the tiles. You can change the randomness of each one's height. You can even add dirt and damage. Imperfections are on by default, and it's what gives it this breakup in the specular highlight, which I really like. But I think I want it to be pretty nice like this. I don't want it to have a lot of imperfections for something like marble tile. Generally speaking, marble tile is fairly expensive. So you would assume that someone who put that in also kept it really nice. Now, you didn't have to do marble. There are a lot of other materials, and you can even make your own materials. It could be ceramic tiles, and then you could get more interesting with it. But again, we have marble tiles. Let's go ahead and create something completely different that we haven't dealt with before. So what we're going to do is call this Quilt, or you could call it blanket or something like that. And what we're going to do, this is the first time we're going to go to the viewer settings and change this to cloth, because we're going to make something interesting out of cloth. So we will go ahead and stop searching, and we will look for fabrics. Now we have a lot of different types of fabrics, and all of them are interesting in their own way. But I think I'm just going to start with something like ottoman, and I'll drag that in. And you can see already just the default version looks interesting. Don't forget that you can always change your displacement height scale in any software you're using. So you can control this in the software that you use later. It doesn't have to be controlled here. But if you ever need to, that's usually under technical parameters, and you can change the height range to what you want. I just recommend usually having a higher height range so you get more options. So this already honestly looks good, but there's a lot of other really cool stuff we can do if we want to create our own. So I just wanted to show you that really quick. You even have options up here for different presets, but I'm going to remove that, and I'm just going to put in a base material. Now, base material in Sampler just means that you can have some generic base stuff. So I can be like, it's a base fabric. So it auto configures roughness and stuff like that to feel kind of like fabric. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to type weave as a filter for cloth weave. And so when cloth weave is added, you can see it starts looking like this huge weave. What I want to do is go under size multiplier and change that to something like X. Let's go to 28. And you can see now it's like a whole bunch of tiny weaves. Again, for this, I'll just turn down the height scale so that we can see it closer to what we'll probably would if we adjusted it properly in our final render. Now, if you don't like this and you want it to be less tiled, you could always do like X18. But cloth weave is really cool because there's a lot of different ways you can control the patterns, and you can control a ton of stuff in here if you just want it to be interesting. But probably the most interesting thing is that you can draw custom weaves. So I personally have an image here, and I'll show you how I got it later, that I'm just going to add on just to show you it can weave out patterns. And in fact, if I reset that to default and turn on custom color, I can even have it weave a colored pattern for me, which is very, very cool. So you can bring in any tiled image and it would do that. I'm going to turn off custom color weave, and then under draw custom weave, I want to show you can also just use the generator. So I can turn on circle and it will generate circles. It's literally any mask you want. So I'm going to remove that. And this is a good time to finally go over the AI generative abilities. So I'm going to click on the generative beta and I'm going to drop this down to pattern. And if I type something in here, like let's say animals, it will come up with interesting tiled patterns. Now it's up to you whether or not you want to use generative AI if you feel like something is unethical about it. Keep in mind, Adobe has now, at least currently when I'm recording this video, done an okay job at finally saying, hey, we're not going to take your stuff unless you allow us to and you tell it to turn on by default and everything. But you can see it generates a couple different options in here, and you can tell it to generate more and more and more. You can just keep getting variations. But let's say we liked something like this one. We can drag it. Well, I need to go ahead and turn on color custom weave. We can literally just drag it into color custom weave, and there we go. So that's pretty awesome. You can just generate patterns really fast for it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and call this saved, and I'm going to create one more material because I do want to show some other features that are generative as well. Not even necessarily only the AI generative, but we'll call this wooden bark. And what I can do is I can come into the generative AI, switch it to texture, and I could call this tree bark. I could search for that and type generate. Now we'll see what it comes up with. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Again, you can generate as many times as you want. So we have some versions here that are not that bad. Again, when it generates these are fully tiling. It already is seamlessly tiling. So if I grab any one of these images, like let's say I like this one and drag it in here, it's going to ask me immediately, do I want to generate it into a material? Now, Substance Sampler does this for any image that you drag in if it's the first image. This has nothing to do with this generative AI. It's just saying, oh, I've detected an image dragged in here. They probably want me to convert it to a material. When it says AI powered for this, it's not using this same AI. In fact, it's using usually on your graphics card powered algorithms to do stuff. Now, you can tell it to do it from all sorts of different types of techniques, but this is the most common one now. And if you don't have an NVIDIA graphics card, you may not be able to do this one. You may only be able to do this one. They're both okay, but the AI powered one for the NVIDIA graphics card is much better. So I'm going to leave it on that. I'm going to hit import. And it's important that you realize it's going to take a while to process. And one thing that I want to mess with is under the image to material AI powered filter, which again is a layer that you can add in there. I want to change the category to wood outdoor lighting, maybe indoor lighting, we'll see. But if you tell the AI, the algorithm, what it's supposed to be generating off of, you can see it gets much, much better results. So I'm going to switch this to a rounded cylinder so that it looks kind of like a tree. And you can see that already looks really, really, really nice for doing almost no work whatsoever. Now in the generator, you can control if you want it to have micro details, how much, larger details, how much. I prefer for this tree bark, it looks like the larger details are doing a pretty good job. So I'm going to leave larger details on pretty high. I want it to be more matte than shiny. And if you want it to remove lighting, like shadows and stuff, that's what this is. By default, it's on and it's doing its best job. So that's pretty awesome. This is already really, really good. Now, I want to also mention that under the generative AI, there's an image button. If you have rights to an image, you can drag it in here legally and it will generate off that image. Now, if you don't understand the power of that, let me explain to you. You can literally go outside with your cell phone, take a photo of tree bark on any tree or grass or concrete or rocks or anything, drag it in here, and then generate. And it will generate a tiled, seamless version of that from that image. And it does a very darned good job. Then you can generate a material using image to material, and you immediately have an unbelievably strong surface that is photo sourced. It's extremely powerful. I cannot stress enough how good that tool is. Now, there's a couple more things I want to talk about kind of at the end, just lump some together. In order to show them off, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this wooden bark. So I'll duplicate it, and I will just call this test wooden bark because we're going to do some stuff with it. So one thing is they do have a filter called Stylize, and it does not work amazingly, Stylization. But if you need a quick version of something stylized, it at least does a little bit. So you can come in here and change it to look like various different types of hand painted. And it does make it a little bit more interesting in that it's not as realistic, but we all know that this is simply just not going to be as good as true hand painted or stylization made by hand within something like Painter. But it's not a bad start, especially if you just want base layers to throw into Painter and paint over. I also do want to mention that there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of options in here that I did not go over. There are ways to scatter various different other materials with atlases. So if I type in atlas scatter, you can see it asks for a specific material for that. And in here, they have things like leaves and all sorts of things like that that I can drag in here. And then it will scatter leaves on there. And I can come into the Atlas scatter and change the amount and turn up the scale or turn down the scale. And again, if this was on a floor or something, you can see how this could be helpful. They have rocks that you can scatter around. They have all sorts of things. They have the ability to change color, contrast, hue, saturation, replace colors, exposure controls, all sorts of crazy different options. There's scratches, oxidation, rust. You can AI upscale imagery. So if you have imagery that doesn't look very high quality, you can AI upscale it. Almost anything you can think of is within here, including even stone walls and everything. I encourage you to go through this and look at a lot of these filters because, again, Designer is the big brother of this program, and it will be able to do everything this program can do and more. The only thing that it cannot do is create things very, very quickly. It's pretty tedious to use Designer for anything advanced. So this is a very good way of just creating very simple things. And even if you mostly use Designer, you can mix multiple materials together in this. And while this tutorial will not go over that, if you created snow within Designer and bricks within Designer, you could overlap them together with height control within this software and then save that out for other software. So knowing all that, there's only one final thing to talk about. I'm not actually going to export anything, but I do want to mention again that the export buttons are here. And while you can immediately send this to other packages, you can also hit export as, and under material settings, you can change it to whatever format you want. So you can change it to a Substance 3D asset file, or even a Designer file. So you can now open this in Designer, or open it, this would be like in Painter, or change it to Targas or PNGs and then save it to specific software. So something like Unreal Engine or Arnold or something like that. You have all of those options. And once you set it correctly, it knows how it should pack the textures for you. It understands that it should output them that way. And then under General, you can choose the name of it and where you want to save it. And it does this per material in the layer. So you would export them out as you needed them. I hope this was a good introduction and you enjoyed it. I hope that more people start using Sampler and we keep getting more features because it truly is a very great software.